The Cathedral of Tarazona is a building that cannot decide what it wants to be. It began as mudéjar in the 12th century, turned Gothic in the 14th, decorated itself Renaissance in the 16th, and was restored in the 21st with a criterion some call respectful and others diplomatic. The result is a cathedral that looks built by committee, beautiful from afar, confusing up close, fascinating if you like layers. The diocesan archive was in a side room on the ground floor, guarded by an archivist who asked me for 3 forms of identification, a letter from my publisher, and a verbal promise that I would not publish anything defamatory about the church. I gave him all 3. He let me in. I was looking for the original documents of the 1511 curse. Not the 1255 excommunication, those were in the archive of the monastery of Veruela, fragmentary and rewritten. The curse was more recent, better documented, and more disturbing. I found them in a folder labeled Trasmoz, Ecclesiastical Dossier, 16th century. Inside, 6 folios in Latin with the uniform calligraphy of an ecclesiastical copyist. And a 7th folio, shorter, in Old Castilian, which was the abbot's communication to the village. What it said was this: by authority of the Holy Father Julius, second of his name, and by virtue of the powers conferred upon the abbot of this royal monastery of Santa Maria de Veruela, the solemn curse is pronounced against the town of Trasmoz and its inhabitants, for the crimes of witchcraft, heresy, and contumacy, and for having been blinded by the arts of the devil. The crucifix of the high altar was covered with a black veil. Psalm 108 was recited in its entirety, verse by verse, and between each verse the monastery bell was struck once, so that the inhabitants of Trasmoz might hear the condemnation from their homes. I read Psalm 108 on my phone. It is the harshest imprecatory psalm in the Bible. May his children be fatherless and his wife a widow. May his children wander about and beg. May his posterity be cut off. Each verse is a specific, concrete curse, without metaphor. The Church did not mince words in the 16th century, and between each verse, the bell. A dry bronze stroke descending from Veruela to Trasmoz through the valley of the Huecha. The villagers, in their stone houses, hearing the toll and knowing that each stroke was another verse of the curse falling upon them and upon their children and upon the children of their children. Until today. Because no pope has lifted what Julius II authorized. But something did not fit. The dossier included earlier documents, the abbot's petitions to the pope, the correspondence between Veruela and Rome. And in that correspondence, the reason for the curse changed. In the first letters, the abbot requested permission to curse Trasmoz for witchcraft. In the following ones, the reason was contumacy and disobedience. The Lord of Trasmoz refused to recognize the monastery's authority over the waters of the Huecha. In the final letter, the one containing the papal authorization, the reason was ambiguous, for causes known to the abbot which it is not prudent to set down in writing. Causes not prudent to set down in writing. A pope authorizes a curse and the reason is classified as reserved. I considered what I knew. The official history said the curse was for witchcraft and disobedience. Historians said it was a conflict over natural resources, water, firewood, land. The witches were a convenient excuse. But there was a third layer. The one Becker had intuited. The one the marginal annotations pointed to without naming. I asked the archivist for the documents of the lordship of Trasmoz. The family archives of the Ximenez de Urrea, which had been deposited at the Provincial Council of Zaragoza but of which copies existed in the diocesan archive, because the monastery of Veruela had copied everything related to its worst enemy. It took me 2 hours to find it. A letter from Pedro Manuel Ximenez de Urrea, Lord of Trasmoz, poet, playwright, one of the most important literary figures of Renaissance Aragon, addressed to a recipient whose name had been crossed out. The ink of the crossing out was different from that of the text, more recent. Someone had erased the recipient's name after the letter was written. The letter was brief, personal, without the florid rhetoric of official documents. It said, The first sentence freed us from their bells. The second will free us from everything else. Let them toll what they will. Each stroke is another nail in the door we need shut. The first sentence, the excommunication of 1255. The second, the curse of 1511. Pedro Manuel was not lamenting the curse. He was celebrating it. Each stroke is another nail in the door we need shut. What door? Shut against what? And then I thought of Tia Casca. Becca's marginal note in letter 6, she was not a witch. She was the one who spoke to them, now fitted with a precision that froze my hands on the archive table. Them was not a vague reference to the spirits of Aragonese folklore. Them were the dead of Trasmoz. The specific dead who had been accumulating since 1255, since the excommunication, since they lost access to the rites that allowed them to pass on. Tia Casca was not a witch or a healer or the village madwoman. She was the mediator, the person who maintained the dialogue between the living and the trapped dead, who negotiated the daily coexistence between the 80-odd flesh and blood residents and the hundreds of residents who had neither flesh nor bone but were still there. The villagers of Trasmoz killed her not out of ignorance, but because she knew too much. She knew the third layer. And her death nearly broke the system, because without a mediator, the dead lost their only interlocutor and the living lost the only person who knew how to speak to them. The castle of Trasmoz is officially closed in October, but the side door of the courtyard has no lock, a detail I discovered when I pushed it without thinking and it opened. I went in. I did not feel guilty. Writers who investigate legends develop a flexible ethics regarding private property. The inner courtyard was a rectangle of stone with weeds growing between the cobbles and the keep dominating everything, square, massive, with windows narrow as half-closed eyes. In the ground floor rooms, the Museum of Witchcraft preserved display cases with medicinal herbs, reproductions of torture instruments, explanatory panels in 90s typography. Mystery tourism for weekend daytrippers. But in the basement, reached by a stone staircase, the museum did not signpost, there was something more. A low-ceilinged vaulted chamber, its walls blackened by soot. In the center, the remains of what had clearly been a forge, a base of refractory stone, ventilation channels carved into the rock, and on the walls, iron hooks from which tools would have hung. The official history said counterfeit coins were minted here. Historians had documented the operation. Geronimo Zurita, in the Annals de Aragon, describes how Don Pedro Ramirez and his son were sentenced to death for forging counterfeit maravedis in the castle of Trasmoz. The metallic sounds the villagers heard at night and attributed to witches were, in fact, the hammering of the coiners. That was the second layer. The historical layer. The one that satisfied the rationalists. But on the walls of the forge, half hidden by the soot, there were marks. Not graffiti. Not mason's marks. Symbols. Carved deep into the stone, with a regularity that ruled out chance. Concentric spirals. Lines crossing at precise angles. Shapes that reminded me of something I had seen in a book on Celtiberian art at the museum in Soria. I took photographs. I cleaned the soot from a section with my jacket sleeve, the jacket turned black, the symbol became clear. A double spiral, identical to those found on the Celtiberian funerary stele of the Upper Douro. Pre-Roman symbols in a medieval forge. I moved closer. The spiral was not decorative, it had a direction, a sense of rotation repeated in every mark on the wall. On the Celtiberian funerary stele, these spirals represented the passage of the soul, not an ornament but an instruction, a route map for the dead. The iron was from the Moncayo, or extracted from the sacred mountain, and the symbols marking it were older than Christianity by more than 1,000 years. What they forged here was not ordinary currency but something more ancient, pieces of a pre-Christian containment mechanism that the lords of Trasmoz had maintained in secret for centuries, ritual markers that functioned as nails in a door no one was meant to open. They were not counterfeiting coins. Or not only. The metallurgists of the castle forged something else with the iron of the Moncayo. something that required symbols older than Rome, something that connected the metal of the mountain with a knowledge older than Castilian, than Latin, than writing itself. The third layer. The one neither the history books nor the museum panels explained. Pedro Manuel knew. Each stroke is another nail in the door. It was not a metaphor. The blows of iron on the anvil, the same blows the villagers heard and attributed to witches, were literally nails. Pieces of a lock forged with sacred iron and sealed with an ecclesiastical curse. Witchcraft, counterfeiting, ritual forging. Lie, partial truth, truth. I left the castle with my hands black with soot and my head full of questions that were no longer those of a writer dismantling legends. They were the questions of someone who was beginning to assemble something far larger than what she had come to take apart. Firmin called me that afternoon. He spoke fast, excited, with the voice of someone who has just received the news he has been waiting 20 years for. Rome has said yes. The reconciliation ceremony will be on the 1st of November. At Veruela. With the Bishop of Tarazona officiating. There will be press. Firmin, I need to talk to you about something. Can it wait? I have to prepare the liturgy. The rite of reconciliation has not been performed in Spain in more than 300 years. The text has to be recovered, adapted, coordinated with the chapter. Firmin, what happens when you lift the excommunication? The sacraments return. The villagers can baptize, marry, take communion, and die with the full rites. Trasmoz returns to the grace of God. And those who already died? Those who died without the rites? Silence. A long silence. The silence of a priest being asked the question he does not want to answer. The reconciliation has retroactive effect, Vega. At least that is what the canon lawyers I've consulted argue. By lifting the excommunication, the souls of those who died under it would automatically be covered. They could pass on, leave, rest. I hung up. I leaned my back against the stone wall of the kitchen and looked at the ceiling with its oak beams, listening to the silence I now knew was not silence. Retroactive effect. I repeated the words aloud, slowly, letting their weight settle. If the reconciliation applied backwards, we were not talking only about Clara, Firmin's sister who had been waiting by her grave for years. We were talking about everyone. Every soul accumulated over 770 years of excommunication, every dead person without last rites, every deceased without passage, every neighbor who had stayed filling the space between Veruela and the Moncayo would suddenly have a way out. A door opened after centuries with the bolt thrown. And if Pedro Manuel had designed the curse as a lock, Firmin was about to insert the key and turn it the other way. The 1st of November. 9 days away. In 9 days, Firmin was going to open all the doors of Trasmoz at once. And the 200-odd people who had spent centuries on the other side of those doors were going to have, for the first time, the option to leave. I thought of the daughter from the 1918 flu, the one in the warm bedroom. I thought of Pilar's husband, who had been standing by his kitchen table for 12 years. I thought of Inigo's grandfather, sitting in a clearing of the beech forest for 8 years. I thought of Pedro Manuel Ximénez de Urrea, who had designed the curse as a lock and had been watching for 500 years to make sure no one opened it. And I thought, if the dead leave, what happens to the door? What happens to what is on the other side?